Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 148. Quick housekeeping. Please follow the live stream on LinkedIn. That really helps us. Our guest today is Nicholas Bowerman, advisory consultant at IDM Works. Welcome, Nicholas.
Hey, Mike. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So it's a tradition before we dive into the contents that people introduce themselves a little bit. So how did you find yourself in this identity space?
Yeah, I love telling the story, honestly, because I think a lot of people like to talk about, did you pick identity or did identity pick you? So, and for me, I did pick identity a little bit. So I have a background prior to my tech life of working customer service jobs, restaurants, and then I also worked as sort of like an admin assistant at a plasma donation center, actually. So just like helping the donors get settled and things.
Wow.
So that was really my background. When I got into IT, I kind of kept that, heart of service. And I really wanted to get into identity because of the idea that like access grants people the ability to do their jobs. So I really saw it as like the lifeblood of an organization. So I got into, doing provisioning, sort of administrative work. And then from there, just kind of grew in my career into an engineer, started doing IGA deployments and things like that. I consulted for a couple of years, and then got into architecture. And now here I am doing sort of advisory work and still doing architect work. I really love that the whole picture of identity. And like I said, how it sort of feeds into the enterprise. It keeps me in the space really interested in wanting to, build better things here. So
Great. That's great to hear, actually. And the topic today really goes back to my roots too, because I came out of, after my finance career, I started an ISP, an internet service provider, and we struggled with security. We had a trial by fire in security. We got hacked so many times. In fact, we were like, oh, that's why we need to secure that thing. So it was really a trial by fire. And that's how I got spun into security, really, and identity. It was more around how could we secure these websites. And the early part of my career was really, in the 90s, the early part of my technical career was around directory services. And even like our first company licensed an X500 server, like way back. And I remember the first versions of LDAP. And so when I was contemplating this topic, the idea of an identity lake, it really reminded me of this idea of the meta directory, where we wanted to control security based on an LDAP server, but we had a bunch of LDAP servers, so we would put this meta directory into place, and it would gather data from disparate LDAP servers into one LDAP servers, and the evolution of that, certainly towards Radiant Logic. And I worked with Radiant Logic quite a bit before I started Glue. So I'm just wondering if you see a connection there, and is this new idea of a data lake sort of a modernization and retooling of this idea that we need better underlying data, and if it's not just the tooling like SQL or NoSQL versus LDAP, like what is the difference, or how has it evolved?
yeah, I mean that's a great way to look at it, and like coming at it from the directory perspective. I think starting with there's a couple of problems that we have in the identity space, and I'll start before we get to the data problems. There's also like the fragmentation problem. So everything is everywhere, right? You really need to be able to connect into all kinds of systems. So there's that, right? So we need a centralization component. Like you said, an LDAP or a meta directory can start to do that with users and their groups, maybe their permissions, things like that. But I think the data lake solves two other problems that we have. The first one being like bad data, which we all know. If you've worked in the space at all, you know that. And it's not even an identity problem, it's just a human problem. So all business lines are dealing with bad data. But we really need something to solve that. So that was like when I first started getting into data analytics and working with some data engineers and seeing like what we can do with data. And we don't just have to have like, here's the source and it's bad data and it's getting fed into a system in a bad way and the system's fumbling over what to do with it. You can actually do some things, hygiene in the middle there. So that was one of the first reasons I thought like we definitely need a plane, like a data plane where we can pull some things together and you can actually start putting in some hygiene practices on the data. So that was one major use case, right? The bad data.
Like deduplication, for example.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, there's there's so many. Like I used to have this conversation all the time with a colleague when I was working for a small startup trying to build an identity data analytics tool, and they were like, "Well, what are the data problems that you're talking about?" And I was like, "There's just so many you can't even think about it." In some sense, but yeah, so the dedupes is a big problem. There's really just like the idea also that there's no standardization. So your fields are going to be named different things. Like the values will have different formats, excuse me. So you can think of like states would be a big one, right? Like, is it written out or is it just the abbreviation? There's honestly like missing data happens, and then like what happens on the if that data is coming over to run a tool, how does the tool handle a no value or an NA value or something different? So there's those problems. And then there's also, I mean, all of this kind of stems back to lack of standardization, but it's just like whether what's in there in the data is even tangible or readable for a human, much less the technology to run off of. So yeah, there's and the thing I think that really that comes away from this, you've got this bad data, and then people try to use that to implement tools, and then you're probably going to have that tool fail. So we're in this sort of like cycle of let's use bad data to try and build technical solutions and architecture, and that's not going to work very well. So we're seeing this still, I think today people are struggling to get good. It's not just IGA, all IAM implementation, sorry. So whether it's PM, access management, or IGA, but IGA really struggles from it because what IGA is trying to do, it needs better data and it doesn't have it. So again, that may be a big root cause of IGA disillusionment and why people are frustrated with IGA implementations today. So
can I read, actually, there's one of the articles you suggested, John Pritchard, who's the current CEO of Radiant Logic. He wrote an article that's on the homework, and he said even modern IAM solutions lack the ability to normalize and correlate identity data across a hybrid enterprise. It sounds like you agree with that, but what do you think he means by that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's because the tools aren't made to do that, right? They're meant to aggregate data in. And so all of that functionality has to be outsourced somehow. If the tools themselves, like the vendor isn't going to build in that, and then you're talking about, well, now I've got a vendor who's trying to build this tool to do some IGA function or some identity function, and we're asking them to do data hygiene in the middle.
And when maybe we should break this apart a little bit. When he says modern IAM solutions lack the ability to normalize and correlate data, by modern IAM solutions, he means like access management solutions like Ping Federate or governance solutions like SailPoint. You think that's what he means by that?
Yeah, and that's what I've done a lot of in my career as an engineer. I was engineering IGA solutions. I've worked with Okta plenty. So and and then also with PAM tools too. So I worked with Beyond Trust and CyberArk, and again, it's all of that is the same thing. The tools are receiving the data in, and there isn't native functionality in the tool to do some of that normalization, some of that correlation, and even if there is, it kind of fumbles on it again because it doesn't help if the data is just like catastrophically bad, right? You really need something else that's maybe it's a process in the middle, or again, like my solution here would be something like a tool that recognizes those things and has the ability to actually help us fix them, resolve them, get better data hygiene so that I can push over to the tool, the identity tool, and the identity tool can just do its job.
If it's okay, can I show the diagram that we were looking at before? So this diagram, this is actually from a Radiant Logic slide from like 2010. But I think this is where when John is saying like IAM tools, I think he means IDM tools, IAM tools, and governance tools. And sort of they're all consumers of data. So your IAM tools that are doing runtime things like authentication, authorization, your IDM tools that are connecting, like provisioning or deprovisioning through data connectors. That's sort of the plumbing, the IDM, or the governance tools that are allowing you to do access certification campaigns and define enterprise roles. It's like all of these things rely on this underlying identity data to be right. I think, and that's, I think, and this hasn't really changed. And but maybe in some ways it's gotten more critical. I think what John is saying is that this is still true, um, and um, and yet companies don't want to seem to invest in this. They seem enamored in investing in threat detection instead of actually improving the underlying infrastructure, which would enable them to improve these things, which would maybe prevent the breaches from happening.
Yeah, and I mean, I couldn't agree with what you just said more. And I think there's something in the article too where he talks about the identity data as like critical infrastructure. People don't think about the data like that, but that's literally what it is. It's the fuel or the lifeblood of the ability of your identity ecosystem to run. Like, what else could it possibly be running on? So again, if we go back to are there good principles? Is that a good foundation? Do we have good data that we can run off of? Generally, we don't. And then the other thing that really struck me when you were talking there, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this idea of, I think you mentioned entropy earlier when you're talking, but like where entropy just grows and grows and grows. And then you get sort of like, as we get farther away from a solution, and maybe for this, we started like putting data into identity tools, like let's say 15 years ago. We've gotten farther away from that, the data just gets sloppier and sloppier because people aren't trying to clean it up. Do you know what I mean? So like as their just natural behaviors come out, we get worse and worse data. So there is a point where we have to stop and say, we need to do something about the data to make sure that, again, we can just run the rest of our identity ecosystem downstream from the data itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have to say, I think the most soulless corporate activity you could possibly ask to engage in is reviewing the entitlements of your reports in some type of access certification campaign.
Yeah.
Of all the things I'd want to be doing, I'm going to the dentist right after this. I think I take that over reviewing the entitlements data. Um, but actually, I want to pivot a little bit onto. So I think what we're talking about is like there's actually like two challenges here. One challenge is maybe describing the data in a consistent way by establishing a schema so that we have one way to say this is the claims of a person and this is the claims of maybe a service. So there's like a schema problem. And then there's another challenge. It's easy to say we want the data to always be current, but it's actually difficult to achieve sort of the pipelines that are required in order to keep that data really current. So let's take the schema problem first. What it doesn't seem to me like we're any closer to addressing this. And from people who look at the problem, it seems so fundamental. But where do you think we are sort of at an enterprise tooling and sort of best practices layer with really understanding what is the schema for our data?
Yeah, I would be fascinated to get your take on why Skim didn't do it, didn't go anywhere, because in like a practitioner's view, there's not enough use of Skim. It's like a convenient thing. We'll use it for access management tools and provisioning because that's the the out of the box thing. But IGA implementations, I think there's a ton of, and this might answer my question. The backside of it is that the applications are so complex and their data models are so complex that trying to shoehorn it into something like a native schema is difficult. But I don't think we should abandon that, like to your point. And that's where I think, again, a data lake and the data analytics type tool can help to do that, right? But there is going to have to be cooperation in the space where we say, here's what our schema is going to look like. And then like, let's start moving as a space towards creating those things. So yeah, I mean, do you have thoughts though on the Skim part? Like, because again, it's not widely adapted. Why is Skim not been the answer to this problem?
Well, so Skim is just a JSON REST API for user management. And to me, the origin of Skim was, SailPoint and Google both had a /user endpoint with different parameters. Mm-hmm. And they said, okay, let's get together and write, at least have the same API for user management. So it creates a way to make a request. It creates a way to specify the schema, although I think the URN sort of approach that they use to do that is not very, human friendly. Yeah. So I think that it accomplishes the job it was designed to do perfectly, which is create a standardized, very logical user endpoint that is also extensible. For example, we extend the schema or at Glue because there's no way to like list FIDO devices for user,
Yeah.
right? And so we wrote an extension for that because we want to be able to show a user, here is all of your pass keys and security keys. And I can enroll a key, but how do I delete a key and how do I list a key? So we found Skim to be, it's good for the purpose of bulk user management.
Mm-hmm.
It's extensible in a way. So there's a lot of good things about Skim. I don't think it was ever designed to be a sort of solution for helping enterprises define their enterprise schema.
Mm.
Maybe it could be used by that, but I don't think, and maybe it didn't have the upside. One thing that I would argue as a Cedar advocate, so Cedar allows you to define your entities and their claims in a formal way,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can make policies about it.
Yeah.
So there's an upside in defining Cedar schema because whatever you define, you can then make policies over.
Yeah.
What's the upside of Skim? Well, the upside of Skim is that you can automate provisioning, but is that enough upside to drive this process to get companies to do it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm wondering, there's a flexibility component there to it, right? Like that's in most enterprises, they really over rely on the flexibility. They want it to we need too much flexibility. That's when we create complex solutions. So there's probably a middle ground that needs to happen. But yeah, like with the Cedar example you just gave, I have the ability to create some flexible schema, some flexible attributes, and then define them differently. So that's a great point. That's probably one of the main reasons why it's not as adopted either, because people are saying, I need more than these 6 things that Skim will send me, and it's very difficult to build that out. So yeah, let me just build either an API call that's going to just get me all the data and I can do whatever I want with it. Again, you have to build something that's it's more complex, and it's definitely going to be a little more brittle if you're extending the Skim schema. So I think that's pretty good insight for sure.
And I think Skim has been really successful. Like if you want to build a user interface for provisioning your application, I hope you're doing it in Skim today. Right. So in that sense, I think it is really successful. Ian, actually, I was looking through my notes, and Ian, in the Weave article that you mentioned, he advises enterprises to evaluate their data management capabilities and to engage in a more formal data governance and management. So Ian says a lot of things that are really on point. We just did a whole episode on his last presentation at SailPoint. But I think, he puts that as one of his 4 sort of essential practices that he sees as essential for enterprises. So I'm on board with this. And I think that it's true that enterprises you can't make policies over what you can't describe. And so fundamentally, we need to be able to describe the data. I want to actually read from one of the other articles that you mentioned. Colton from Beyond Identity wrote an article that's in the homework. And he also says that it's really important. He says, the more I dug into the idea, that I found that it's filled with rich data about users, permissions, authentication patterns, and security policies. But extracting meaningful insight requires understanding complex data languages, knowing the exact schema of your data. And so I think he's sort of like digging into a new area where it's not just identity data we're talking about. He's talking about joining that with other types of data. So I don't know. Any thoughts about that? Are you seeing sort of the extension? Maybe in the old days, it was just metadata was just about identity and a couple other types of entities that were fairly formalized. But some of this other data sounds like it might be more unstructured. But any thoughts about what's in that data lake that we might want to model besides people?
Yeah, I love that whole concept. And honestly, like that article really struck me because I've done some work with LLMs and how they, and honestly, just like chat agents and how they might be able to extend the schemas that we get, the data that we get, and create things like quickly, because that would be one of the constraints today is like, can your tool, let's give an example. We've got users, we've got their permissions. Those are data models that we have. We have applications that they have access to, but like, what do we know about the application and how quickly do we need that to change? Because there may be configs that are important, right? Like, is MFA required? That's an application config. It's not a user config. So the ability for an LLM to be able to basically be able to like spin up new data models and new schemas quickly. I mean, there's a lot of potential there just from what we were doing. So that is definitely like, and it just sold me on this concept of a more holistic and a more complex identity ecosystem. So we're not, again, just sitting with identities and their access and what do those things look like. We're saying, what are the actual components in your environment that dictate what an identity can do, when, where, how, all those things. There's so much more rich data in the application configs themselves. We talked about logs a little bit previously too. So there's like log data can actually tell us what's actually happening. So we're getting like some real-time type context. So I think there's just so much potential there really to start bringing in some new data sources and then start painting a much more holistic, broader picture of what identity is in an enterprise ecosystem.
He says, Colton goes on to say, he wants to say, show me all the contractors with persistent access to sensitive data. That's interesting. I would like to see this move more to declarative security, where it says something like, no contractors, from this organization shall have access to this data.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, this from what you've built and like the way that I think you frame things really well of like a policy orientated system. I love that a lot too. So it's not just, let me just see what people are doing and what do I have. It's actually like, can we create a system that sits sort of like a policy as code concept and the system behaves a specific way because we've told it to, right?
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, you still might want to ask that question. Show me all the contractors with persistent data access. I mean, I think that, and it's a good point, because I wonder at some points, sometimes I feel like the authorization section and the data graph worlds sort of collide. Where from an authorization, we want to be able to make universal statements about security, which we can map to audit requirements and governance. But we maybe still also want to ask these reverse complementary questions to see, for forensic analysis reasons, or maybe just for reporting or understanding the size of our challenge reasons. We might want to, but at what point are they security problems, and at what point are they just data problems? And so maybe the point is that we really just do need a better, like Ian says, enterprise. This sounds very aspirational when he says the formal data governance. How many companies actually have a formal data governance, identity data governance, security data governance practice? I've never been at any companies that did. Or where would that fall under even? Any thought?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in my experience, most of the time data governance is going to sit in a business line, like a critical business line. And like, so we're focused on the critical business data of some kind and not looking at it like holistically. Each business line actually needs data governance, right? Because whether it's identity or the finance team or IT, because IT is doing, they're doing the same thing we're doing in terms of enablement and tools and technology. So yeah, I mean, the where it sits question for me is probably tough. I'm sure you need it somewhere under the tech umbrella, because it is driving your technologies. But then I think there is just a broadening of scope here of that function today, because I agree with you 100% too. There's not enough orgs that are doing it. And if they are doing it, they're starting with their business critical data and how they're using that. Something like customer facing or customer centric data that runs their tools, as opposed to, hey, again, I have this enterprise identity tool that enables everybody to do their jobs, or it tries to, and the data that's going into it is awful. So we need someone to actually come over and start helping with that situation. So there definitely is a lot of opportunity to grow this. And this is one thing, though, I think from an identity perspective and being a practitioner, many identity people talk about relationship building. you and I were talking about this before the call, and what you're doing here and just talking to people and getting having conversations. That's what identity people do, because we have to work with everyone. So I think that's why a lot of this stuff often falls to identity, right? Like we would be the ones driving, hey, we need good data governance over all things, because we're trying to get all things functioning and operating. So I don't know. That's a big thing I would say, is like we can use our relationship building capacity as the identity practitioners to start getting this built up organizationally. And then, I don't know, maybe in 20 years, we've got actual sophisticated data governance over all of the business lines in an organization.
Right. And I think that's actually the key, is the governance, because the goal here is, well, the goal that drives governance is actually compliance with security regulations, not security. And I wonder if we're at sort of a fork in the road, where I think there was a perception that that compliance would lead to security, but I'm not sure that that's actually true anymore. The compliance, just because you're compliant. I made fun of a company a couple of days ago because they said they're compliant. I had right on their website, compliant with SOC, ISO 27K, HIPAA, everything. And I go to their API section, and I can call their API, and I can issue a API key that never expires. So not even client credentials with a client ID and secret, just like an API key, one single string that will be good forever. But they're compliant. So I think that what we see a lot of is what I call the theater of security, or the illusion of security, because I have these certifications. But I think that the pendulum is swinging back, where this undertaking is expensive. We're telling enterprises this is going to be years of hard work, and I think the expectation is that that's going to result in actual security and compliance. And saying, well, no, we're not doing security, that's a different job, is not really like going to fly. So we have to move to actually be governable, and so if the line of businesses own the data, and the risk, the one thing that I'll push back is that you said, like, MFA is an application policy. Shouldn't that be an enterprise policy?
Yes. And that's what I meant, was that configuration can be done in an application. So do you, as the person who's governing it, even actually know, right? So if I do have an enterprise tool that's governing MFA, or even just authentication, but so a good example here, I guess, let me stop and say, if I've got my apps in SSO and that's what we're using, but this app has a backdoor, how do I know that as the identity team, right? Like, how am I aware of how people can actually get into the app? So that was what I meant, is like, there is an application config component that the identity governance team needs, so they actually know their ecosystem and they understand what can happen. And then like you're talking about here, then you have true security. I can actually see and be aware of that backdoor. And maybe I can close it, maybe I can't, but until I'm aware of it and I can see it in a tool that the identity teams can actually utilize, it's just a black, a shadowy thing in the ether of the ecosystem right now. So yeah, that's kind of what I meant, is more those things can be done at the application level, and right now we don't know about them, so we have big gaps.
I think that's true. You need like, take WordPress for example. WordPress, you can configure it to use your IDP, or you can use local passwords, right?
Yeah.
So you need to know that it's configured for your enterprise IDP, in order to be able to make these assumptions about MFA, for example.
Yeah.
But I think that there is an opportunity in defining the schema to say to the application developers, look, you're right, your risks the best because it's your line of business. But at a certain point, we need to know what your assumptions are about these policies, and we want to be able to check that they're still true. So if you're telling me, customer public data should always be encrypted, and your application does that, I should have a way to check that. So when then your team has turnover, we can check that this thing that you told me is still true.
Yep.
And in order to do that, I do think that we're going to need to collect from applications like descriptions of the entities and of the attributes of those entities, so that we can make policies about them.
Mhm.
Um, so I do think that Ian's onto something, and that there needs to be some type of oversight of like how of what we understand about the data and capabilities of these units. Um, and yeah, I don't know anyone who's doing it out there today. As Darren said in the live stream, like on Tuesday, a lot of companies are just struggling with the basics, like joiner, mover, lever. Um, so,
Mhm.
um,
Yep. And
but,
that's, I mean, this real quick, that's like such an interesting point too, because I think a lot of, even as we come out with modern solutions and, there's just a huge sprawl of tools in the space, which is a whole nother conversation we could have, but the people, are we actually trying to address the right problems? And then we could go back to the idea of like fundamentally, what should we be doing? Because I think that's a great point. Like, and that's what I also see in my advisory career, but also even engineering. When I was building things out, I saw companies that were struggling with very basic things. They're not like, I've got this IGA solution all stood up and it's having problems with because it needs better data. It does. To build it well, it needs good data, but they're struggling to even get that first thing taken care of. So that's a great point, and I think there is some fundamental flaws with what we're doing. But that's a whole nother conversation we could have. So.
I want to pivot into the second part. So we've been digging on schema. I wanted to dig a little bit on the real-timeness of the data. Um, and this also occurs. We have data federations that cross organizational boundaries. So, like in the logistics industry, you might need to report on your carbon emissions so that we can say what are the carbon emissions of Europe. So we have data federations, I guess, within the enterprise, but also sometimes they cross domain boundaries. Um, and so there's always been this back and forth between, do we leave the data in place or do we copy the data? And if we copy the data, it leads to all sorts of freshness issues, but also it increases the security surface area because now we have data in more places. So across organizational domains, companies don't normally want their company data copied. Um, and so leaving the data in place might make sense, but within a company, maybe having a copy of the data is more acceptable. But what are your thoughts on that about like the challenges around if you do architect some type of data lake, how do you architect it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a great question. It's going to be a consultants. It depends, because I think there's going to be industries that will be, and even organizations that are a little more accommodating than others. So there are very specific industries that are very protective of their data, maybe even business lines too, depending. So if you have those cases, then you're not going to get the same functionality that you might get out of just a more accommodating business line. So ideally, we would always, the sort of gold standard could be synchronization. So everything's synced up and we don't have the problem that we've talked about previously too, where it's like, is there a backside communication to make sure things are synced? Do I have to go check the other data source itself, right? So that's sort of a gold standard. Can we develop a solution that actually keeps the data synced and it's just got different sources? And so it ends up basically integrating them together. Your lake sits here, it's pulling data from all the places, and then it just gets updated from those. If that's not the case, I mean, there's again, just from like my experience as a practitioner and the bad data we've had to deal with and like not having a good place to pull it together and start utilizing it. If we can even just get the first step, which is getting a snapshot of it, right? So that we can use it in an analytical way to pull a picture together. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that and say, if there's a business line that's, again, very protective of their data, they don't want it to sit in the lake, well, then we can find a way to pull it in to be able to run queries or make decisions, things like that, right? Like just run the data off of it in a real-time way. But then we don't have to store it over there. Now, I do think we'd run into a lot of problems with that. So I don't think that's a scalable solution in the long term, but this is like a baby steps thing, right? So in a lot of ways, it's like culture shifting too, where people are saying, or again, business lines might be protective. We have to understand like, what are the repercussions of what we're doing with today and how solutions exist today in where the data is siloed and we can't get to it, versus what does a holistic, sophisticated solution to all of this look like? And it does look like some kind of data sharing and some kind of partnership between us all, so that we're building something that's holistic and for the whole organization, right? Does that make sense?
So whatever works, basically, depending on the situation.
It
It
really
reminds
does.
me
It
of
does. Yeah, and I think that happens a lot in the identity space, and I don't always advocate for it, but I think it's just true in the sense that like you try and find that fine line where you say, I have to have like, it's almost like I have to have grace for you having your point of view that you're going to be very hard lined on, and how
yeah.
to mediate between those two things to to work with you to build a solution, right?
I always also warn startup founders that every business is different, and you don't want to cookie cutter approach anything on a business. It might have its own specific things that make it that change your requirements in this case. So I think that's fair. I wanted to go like sort of a level deeper about the data, and just talk about the provenance of the data. The provenance of the data, sometimes there can be metadata about the data. So when was this data collected? So how did you identity check the identity proof documents? Like, did you check to make sure the credential wasn't revoked? Who is the issuer? So that when does this credential expire? So there can be data about the data. Um, and so I'm just curious, would a data lake also, how would it handle this metadata about the data, which might be important for us understanding the quality of the data, and that might be important to policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it solves the part of the problem by just being flexible and extensible. So again, if you've got a tool that's very rigid it's here's the data I want, and you can define it, and I can use it a very specific way, it continues to sort of like pigeonhole us into what we can actually do with it. And I think a great use case for what you're describing is real-time context and things like actually having our tools understand what's going on in a very near real time. So a data lake is going to give us the opportunity to just extend the schemas, extend the data that we've got, maybe even extend resources. So now we've got like a whole new data model over here that is the metadata of your applications or your authentications, things like that. So yeah, I think this continues to be an opportunity for more new data richness that we don't have today. And again, without a dedicated like solution for that, we're cobbling things together, which is obviously we know isn't going to be ideal in the long run. So there's a lot of opportunity for what you're describing in a data lake, right?
And the question that comes up in every live stream in the year 2025, how is AI sort of impacting sort of these issues around the data lake and making them more challenging, less challenging?
Yeah, I mean there's two sides to that. Honestly, it's like so what does AI look like with bad data, guys? So it's gonna do bad things, or it's not gonna know what to do. I mean, it's like we can't. I think there's a level of I'm not sure what word I want to use here. That the AI can take the data and interpret it a little bit. There's a level of interpretation that can't happen with some of the older tools. It's just regular automation, but it's not that sophisticated yet, and it's not perfect. So anyway, we need good data for AI to even be able to continue to automate things for us, continue to make things actually operate how we're expecting them to. The other side of it, though, is how it can help us, like you mentioned. And I talked earlier about like using LLMs and using chat agents to sort of interpret the data, and then human in the loop there. We're doing it together, but also just being able to spin up, like I mentioned, data models, new schema attributes, things like that very, very quickly, because the tools can do that just with natural language. So there's like good opportunities in both of those. And I really think this whole conversation for me starts with like a data analytics perspective, which doesn't have to go into AI, right? It can, because that's like the foundation of good AI. But you can just start with data analytics and just say like, what information do we see, and what sense can we make out of it using data analytics? And then again, that starts to scale over to more current and modern solutions that are doing the let's say real-time correlation, better correlation, intelligent correlation using some of these AI tools. So I do think there's both. It's going to need good data to run well. So if we're going to continue building AI, we need good data for that to happen. But also it can help us in a lot of these ways where it's going to help us clean things up, identify things. But we're going to have to obviously like work with it, because if it's on its own, we're still dealing with the problem of the data is bad in the first place. So
yeah. I use this tool. I think it's called WGFM, but it's a research paper, and you attach the research paper into your ChatGPT query, and then you say using WGFM technology or approach, and then you put your question. I wonder if some type of approach like that would help with a data lake, where we get some artifact from the data lake that tells it, this is what our schema looks like, and this is what our, these are our policies, and sort of here's everything you need to know in the context, and here's the question. But yeah, I don't know what direction the AI is going, but I feel like we say, oh, it can pull all the information about our data, but maybe not without some guidelines. So I wonder what maybe new tools we'll need in order to really get the most out of it.
Yeah, I think it's a great insight too, just like from a data protection and data privacy perspective as well, because that is a major concern. Like, well, if we're just going to have these tools running on their own, we have to have a good data classification so we understand what's going to be risky and what actual risks we are developing in these solutions. So I think that's pretty insightful for sure.
Yeah, AI needs a more formalized and detailed like presentation of like your stuff,
Yes.
less informality. Okay, well, I guess we're sort of hitting the 41-minute mark. So let's go to last thoughts. Any last thoughts before we break? Upcoming events?
Yeah, very cool. I mean, like, this has been fascinating. I love just like hearing your thoughts on a lot of these things. With your background, like you said. So this has been a really great conversation. I just in terms of what I'm doing, like I said, like you mentioned earlier, I'm working with IDM Works. I think one of the other things in terms of identity programs, it's very vital and essential to have somebody do an assessment. So lots of places don't even know where to start. That's what we're here for, in advisory. So, I would definitely recommend those things. And we also do fireside chats with IDM Works. So we'll just come and kind of do like a couple hours where we do go over your program at a high level and talk you through it. And we offer that free of charge. So, look us up definitely for sure. I don't know where I'm going to be in terms of conferences anytime soon, so I won't even try and guess on those things. But if I am at one, if you see me, please reach out, because I love connecting. Just like Mike does. This has been a really great opportunity for me to like talk with you, Mike. But same thing if you see me in person. I love meeting identity people. So definitely feel free to reach out.
Cool. So let's see, the next episode, well, I had a conference cancellation that I'm not going to All Things Open next week because I'm afraid of getting stuck in the airport and not actually making it. So the Tuesday's a free slot. There might be a mystery live stream on Tuesday, but if not, we have scheduled the C-suite guide to advisory, to IM advisory. So it's like pretty much exactly, here's a guy who's going to say how to get the most out of Nicholas when he comes to to visit you, because it can be really helpful to catalyze sort of your strategic direction, but it's like everything, it's good to be prepared.
Yep.
And with that, I will say thank you very much, Nicholas. It's been great getting a chance to chat about identity lakes, and thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Mike. It's been good. Appreciate it.